So I think the reason we really enjoy conversations is because we get to show off our entire toolbox from a signaling context, as Robin Hanson would say. And that makes perfect sense biologically, that we would attempt to show that we are good allies within a certain tribal context, and that's why you feel rewarded when you are able to talk about many different complex, varied topics. But it is the case that if you actually wanted to make a difference, given that the world is saturated with information, what you would probably do is just pick a single message, make a pitch for it that is just well designed to affect the most amount of people, and just repeat it again and again and again. So I should probably do that, like design my own Aubrey de Grey or Kurzweil style, same repetitive thing that I say every single time. And if I do, it's going to have to be around physicalism and how that implies that you don't actually die. Because I think that that's like the biggest misconception in the world around me that I see. It's like people just exist at that step right above their sort of native religion that they grew up with. And that one step above is like Richard Dawkins or something. It's not what is actually going on. And then it's only the people who really care, the people who for some reason or another really care about what is true, the sorts of people who will prick needles through their eyes and stare into the sun just to tease out the terrible truth, right? It's those who bear the spirit of Newton who go into like the steps above of that, right? And there you go into the physics, you go into rationality, you go into a reductionist framework. What actually is experience? And that's when you realize things like the theory of relativity, implying relativity of simultaneity, therefore an eternal block. You realize also that reductionism implies that experiences can't actually be, like a brain, which is just a static object. A brain just sitting there isn't an experience. So you have to look for experience in particular motions occurring within it, in particular causal chains within it. And that's when notions of my brain start to dissolve. It doesn't make sense to think that you are a brain with a constant identity and a constant persistent soul, which then is eliminated at some point, and therefore you have a capital D death event, right? You don't get those capital D death events, and a lot of people do assume that this is what you get in the absence of a fairy tale of some kind. But actually, if you're really being physical about this, then you don't get death events with capital D. You do get change, and therefore forgetting of everything that you ever were, but you don't actually get experience itself ceasing to exist, because it's nothing more than a physical configuration. And what is this physical configuration? Well, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I know, what I think at present is that it is the same sort of causal shapes that are formed from any other system which is making these predictions. So for example, like I coded an LSTM network and fed it Neon Genesis Evangelion and stuff from my biology textbook, Wikipedia articles, text from Future Timeline, just to see if it would come up with something interesting, right? And so this thing just predicts like the next character. That's all this LSTM network does. It's very simple. It's just like any other sort of machine learning algorithm. It's on a quest to update its weights and biases and nudge its multidimensional gradients so that it can find a local minimum that optimizes the loss function. And that's all it does. It's just, in other words, doing math. It's just a statistical process. And I don't personally believe that this LSTM network on my MacBook is conscious, even though it came up with moderately entertaining stuff, right? It's not actually conscious, but, well, and, you know, some people would disagree. Jürgen Schmidhuber, the guy who actually designed LSTM networks, believes his babies are conscious. He actually says it, and I just don't think so. It's hard for me to believe that what we mean by consciousness is that. But that doesn't mean that what consciousness is actually made out of has to be something fundamentally different than these causal relationships. So it is a case that you just have different levels of complexity. So let this complexity be represented by these connected circles. So you have these circles, and this is some level of complexity. Then you have more levels of complexity. So you've got stuff predicting other stuff and using that stuff for its own predictive purposes. So you have more levels of complexity. And then you have other algorithms which begin to predict other systems. They begin to develop sort of an inner knowledge, an inner model, inner representations of things. Whereas at lower levels, there's no representation of anything. So the more you connect them, at some point, you get consciousness, you get self-modeling, you get something which is qualia by the intensity of modeling, of self-modeling, of being able to predict itself. And remember, these predictions don't actually have to map onto some sort of external reality. A lot of times, for example, you'll see someone walking far away and you'll see their face, you'll experience the qualia of their face, and then they approach closer and you realize, oh, that was like completely different face. Maybe you saw a male first and then it was a female once they approach closer. So the qualia is a prediction. It really is. It's fashioned of that sort of prediction stuff. Another thing is, like, if you're prodded with a utensil, you could be prodded with an objectively cold utensil. But if you're told beforehand that it's going to be very, very hot, you can actually experience hot qualia at the very instant that it prods you. And so I really do think that this is what experience reduces to. It is not something, inherent perhaps in biological sauce of carbon atoms arranged in a certain way. And this is when you get substrate independence. And by the way, silicon has the same amount of valence electrons. It's pretty similar. And so it's kind of just a mute argument to think that there's something so special about biological organisms. I mean, it's intuitive because we think in these terms, right? We think things have essences, right? The Mongols would think the river is its own soul and the wind is its own soul. The Greeks had, fire, earth, and water. So we like categories and essences to things. Elan Vital, that life has this soul of some kind, and we translate that even into modern scientific sort of contexts as biology having a certain property of some kind that other things don't have. And that's where you get the misconception that you are just the brain as opposed to the causal relationships, the computations being produced in the brain. And so when you realize that you are actually the computations and that these don't care about time, because time is not a thing which is sweeping forward in this Newtonian fashion that is just ticking onward, and the same clock applies to everyone, and instead it is the case that you are just these relationships, no matter how far apart they are. So you could, in one moment, be anesthetized, and thousands of years later, as long as it's the same pattern, even if it's in a galaxy far, far away, that's going to be appropriating that past in the same way that you appropriate the past of whoever went to sleep last night, even though the Earth moved your room around the sun, and you're in a different spatiotemporal location. You feel like it was just like last moment ago that you were awake. And anesthesia, right? It's the same thing. It's because the computations don't care about time. Time is irrelevant. It's not a real thing. It's our brain creates time because it's designed to make sequential predictions. And that's also what gives us the illusion of the sequential nature to everything. Whereas in fact, it's not. We exist in an eternal object that has the future laid out, the past, the present, everything is already being experienced forever. So that's really the main idea, that you can have self-modeling at some point. At some point, you get sufficient self-modeling, sufficient self-predictive capacity that it becomes conscious. And so I do think that the question of is something conscious or not conscious is a factual question also. This is where I disagree with some reductionists who think that it's a matter of definition. And I don't really think it is. And I don't really think it is. I think that at some point you get simple experiences. I'm sure there's an edge where it's so fuzzy that it's just very fuzzy. But at some point, it's undeniable. At some point, you have experience, and it's undeniable because it's just intense. It feels itself to exist from its inside. And at some point, you just have an LSTM network predicting characters in text. So it's not conscious. It's not conscious. And it seems that the selection pressures that caused this prediction of self to evolve, and therefore for consciousness to evolve, had social reasons. And so we can expect that they're going to exist within social mammals. They're going to exist within elephants, within humans, within cetaceans, and so on. Because they serve a role within only that context. So it's not the case that self-prediction is necessary for intelligence. Intelligence is just a capacity to do things. And so I made a video about this where perhaps orangutans have more self-modeling capacity and therefore more consciousness than chimpanzees, but yet chimpanzees are more capable. It may be the case that certain humans are less conscious than others and nonetheless are more intelligent than others. And some might argue that may be the reason why some people have no trouble denying consciousness or just saying, it's an illusion, because maybe they actually experience less consciousness and think, might as well not be an illusion. It's sufficiently tenuous to me that I'm not even sure I have it, right? And I don't really think so. I mean, I think that humans are sufficiently convergent upon their experiences, but that it wouldn't be reasonable to just attribute it to that, to why some people, endorse sort of eliminativism more than others. But, it's not out of the question. That consciousness is actually about, it's really a different kind of predictive process than just a general kind of prediction. It's prediction with regards to particular internal states. And that's also the case, that's also the reason why you have you experience consciousness more intensely when you're in a social environment. When you're in a social environment, you feel more alive. And whereas when you're just alone, when you're meditating in a cave away from all society for 50 years, you are slipping away. You're slipping away into nirvana. You're going away from consciousness. You're shaving off a lot of these things which cause you to do a lot of self-modeling. And so in one of my DMT videos, I said that DMT reveals the intrinsic character of human mind space ultimately, and you don't get access to anything more, contrary to what people seem to intuitively believe, that they have accessed or made contact with something more than just what is possible within the sort of range of human experience. And I'm open to the idea that they're not, for the same reason. I think that you're shaving off some of this self-modeling capacity, and therefore getting simpler and simpler self-modeling. And therefore these computations can be used by other stuff, as long as they serve a causal role. Because remember, it's all about the causality. It's not about spatiotemporal location. So long as you are having a causal role into something, you are going to form a part of its self-model. And so if you're forming the part of the self-model of something that's like way out there in the future, that's like alien to you, that you have no idea what it is, you are just a part of that. It's like, it doesn't make a difference how far in space or time anything is, in the same way that people used to think about the EPR paradox. Like, you can't have transmitting information from one particle to the next instantaneously. That would violate special relativity. People were aghast by this, but turns out it's true. And a similar situation is going on with computationalism, with experience. Like experience, the causality specifying experience doesn't care about spatiotemporal location. And I've explained this many, many times with the example of seeing a shape with a certain color, because the processing is already distributed in different regions of space-time. And yet we still see a colored shape, right? So it must be the case that computations specifying experiences don't care about time. They don't care about something which turns out to not be as fundamental as we intuitively thought it was before, under a Newtonian mechanics conception of reality. So yeah, the point is, if you start shaving all this self-modeling, whether by doing DMT or just by getting old, I mean, it's a known fact in gerontology, or at least a theory in gerontology, that as people get older, they start losing a lot of this self-modeling, and therefore that's why they become sort of more self-absorbed, and they feel less pressure to contribute to society and to do stuff for society. Part of it is they're actually physically losing consciousness. Their existence is becoming lighter and lighter and lighter, because they're doing less self-modeling. As they get older, they're losing that capacity. And so whether you're just getting old, whether you're getting a disease, whether you're going to sleep, whether you're taking DMT, all of these experiences, I would imagine, are shaving off this complexity, and at some point you become very harvestable. You become very simple, so you fit into a lot of other computations, regardless of where they exist in space or time. And that's the closest you ever get to death, is to become more widely spread, so to speak, as opposed to being highly specific way over here. The more self-modeling you have, the more conscious and intense your experience is, and the more particular it is. So that's really it.